Hey guys, Kyle here from Z1, here to talk about fluids and answer the age-old question of what oil should I use? What better way to do this than bring in Motul?
How's it going, guys? My name is Nico. I'm the technical manager for Motul in the Americas. I've been around for 10 years in the company, working with lubricants in other OEMs. So I'm guessing we're going to have a good conversation about fluids and getting through the age-old question.
All right, good. To get started, let's look at our Global Time Attack 370Z. We built this for Global Time Attack's limited class 2019. It's featured in Nissan SEMA booth. I'm sure you've seen it. Most of the viewers have as well. It's full race car. It's 3.7 hybrid with twin turbos, a sequential gearbox, full cage, lots of weight reduction, aero, coolers, V-mount front end. It runs time attack, so 20-minute full power heats, and also as an expedition vehicle. So we have customers riding along session after session after session. So it's hot for hours on end.
Yeah, all of a sudden time attack turns into endurance racing, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's actually a great way to start our conversation, as it's built for performance. We know performance involves a lot of heat, a lot of load being put through the engine and torque. So that's the reason why we have a specific package for that. And that package is sort of constructed with the Nismo Competition oil. So Nismo Competition oil has been a research and development conjunction effort between Nismo in Japan and our R&D guys over there in Japan as well. Fully tailor-made formulations for this type of application. Chemistry is completely different to what you would expect on a regular engine oil. So I would say this is your best bet at keeping this engine, this transmission, this powertrain package alive during those harsh driving events.
Right. So you recommend Nismo Competition oil for the engine. What about transmission?
Well, for the transmission, we also have a proprietary formulation here, which is the Nismo Competition oil differential 75W140. You're probably wondering about the viscosities and why go into a 5W40 in the case of the engine, and why shifting to a 75W140 for the transmission. And it has a lot to do with heat and load. Heat is one of the biggest enemies that we have here in these applications, over revving as well. So for that, we will need to have a look at our whiteboard on the back here, which has a lot of the explanations on why the formulation is so important.
All right, Nico, we've got the whiteboard. Tell me what you got.
All right, so purpose of this is to understand you a little bit about the recipe and where each component works. So we have this first little graph here that might be simulating what's going on with the crankshaft and the bearings, right? So you have your crankshaft here, turning right, a little bit of your engine block, and say this is the fluid, right?
Right.
So we got our magnifier here, and we're looking at what's actually going on between the surfaces and the engine oil, right? It works for pretty much everything, but the engine oil example is kind of good.
Right.
So if we want to control wear and tear, we need to keep components apart. That is done with the engine oil.
Right. Makes sense, yeah?
Yeah. So depending on how many RPMs, what's the load, what's the speed, etc., you need these different elements inside the engine oil to work in different cases. There was a guy that studied this relationship between friction and some of the physical parameters. It's called Strivek. We don't have to go down deep into that one. But the cool thing about this is that he managed to describe 3 different regimes. Now, say you're starting your car.
Right.
Low RPMs, you start driving, and all of a sudden you say, okay, I'm gonna hit the gas. So that's a typical boundary condition inside the engine. Why is it called boundary? Because you will have metal to metal contact.
Okay.
So this is where friction modifiers and potentially anti-wear additives have to work. You need to prevent that metal to metal contact, or make it as swift, as easy as possible, in order not to run into troubles with these components and all that.
Right, okay.
Now, you're running on constant load, maybe coasting down a highway. You start having more RPMs, your oil pressure goes up, of course, and you have more separation between the components. So as you can see here, your coefficient of friction starts going down, and you come into something that is called the mixed regime. Now, why is it called mixed? Because you might have some metal-to-metal contact, but you are mostly on a safe condition with your components separated by your oil film.
Okay.
And now the best part of this whole thing is once you get into the hydrodynamic regime. Why is it called that way? Because you have full separation of the components, and the only friction that you're going to have is the fluid friction coming from the oil, which you can say is the friction between these different films of oil that I put down there as an easier way to explaining, okay, why is base oil so important?
Right, and that sounds like that's where you want to be.
Exactly, yeah. You want to stay as much as possible within these two regimes, mixed and hydro.
Okay.
So that's the reason why you cannot say, okay, a good engine oil is going to be the synthetic oil, or a good engine oil is going to be one that's mixed with this type of additives, or the more CDP I add to the oil, the better it is. No, you need to find the perfect balance, because all of these guys are going to be fighting for these surfaces.
Okay.
So it's like an orchestra. You can't have one musician playing on top of the other. Everybody knows where they're coming into the play, and this is the same exact thing.
Right, and like musicians, the additives are working together to cover all operating conditions.
Exactly.
Okay.
Along with the bass oil.
Okay.
So good rock band has to have a good bass player and a good drummer, right?
Right.
Well, in this case, you need to have a good bass oil, but all the other guys have to play along as well, and that's where the additives come.
Okay.
So this is like the simplest explanation that I could give you about an engine oil formulation, how it works. So say regularly good product would have this type of coefficient or friction coefficient curve. What you want to do, if you want to increase efficiency, you want to get that friction coefficient down in each and every one of these different regimes. And that is the important thing about working with the factory's R&D, because you know exactly which components are working under which regime, and you can fine-tune your formulation to find that perfect balance. That is what Nismo Competition oil is doing here.
Right, makes sense.
All right. So talking about the engine oil first.
All right.
First thing first. What do you want? You want more horsepower, and that horsepower is going to give you more torque, right?
Right.
It's mathematics. So in order to have that, and also being able to protect the engine, you need, first of all, premium synthetics.
Right.
Because that's the true foundation of the engine oil. But then again, you need the additives to go with it, because the additives are going to give you these specific properties that you need, mostly for more efficiency, more horsepower in this case. So good thing about Nismo Competition oil, the 540, is you have a unique blend of synthetic oils. Nothing of the stuff that you would get on a regular engine oil for your daily use. And that is why you have very little formulation space. So you want some of these specifics, friction modifiers, additives clinching onto the parts, not fighting against each other. So good synthetics, ester-based synthetics are going to give you a lot of protection against wear, are going to give you good detergency without having to rely that much on additives, as you would probably do on a regular street oil.
Right.
So that is one thing. Then when you want to tune how the oil behaves in different loading stages of the engine, you know, over revving, demanding high torque in low revs, then you need to start tuning what type of additive are you going to use for each of those situations.
Right.
So that's where the friction modifiers and the anti-wear extreme pressure additives come into play. So you need to give room to each of them to work in these situations. You can't have these guys fighting against each other on the components.
Right, and the balance of additives is perfect for a car like this, where we pull out of a corner. under full boost and run it all the way to 8,400 RPMs.
Exactly.
So
wide open
it's different
throttle.
conditions. Okay.
Yeah. So the key with formulating a good engine oil or whatever fluid is finding the right balance between the base oils and the additives. And that's the important part of working with the OEM, because you know which components they use, which surface treatments they're going to be using.
Right.
So you don't want any of these additives maybe getting your components into trouble, promoting corrosions in some of these DLC components. That's, I would say, the most important thing about buying Nismo Competition oil. It was made for the OEM with the OEM.
Right. Okay, while we have Nico here, let's ask some questions that I, as an enthusiast, have. You mentioned ester oil. I've always heard the term, no idea what it is. Can you please explain that to us?
Yeah, sure. Esters, I believe, are the best way to give you this perfect balance between efficiency and protection against wear and tear. So whenever we have high load, high revving, high shear effort that needs to be withstood by the lubricant, we always go to esters and other non-conventional synthetics.
Okay.
Difference with esters and regular synthetic oil is that you can fine-tune the molecules to withstand more heat, to maybe control better contamination with water. So depending on the components that you react, you can get different types of esters. You will get around 15 of them. So the important thing when it comes to automotive applications is that you have a very thermal stable formulation and a formulation that can take humidity in a very stable way, so you get a high oil life expectancy. So what's the important thing about esters in a transmission oil? Because you were telling me, hey Nico, we have a very good thermal management system here. It's being controlled by the ECU. Whenever we run into trouble with temperature, we're going to trigger some pumps that are going to cool down the system.
Right.
Did I get it right?
Let me take a second to explain to the viewers.
Yeah.
We have a PMU in this car that has temp sensors on the diff and temperature, or on the diff and transmission, and the pumps keep the fluids in a narrow range of temperatures. So it's a very smart system. So sorry to get back to it.
Well,
so why do I still need fluids? What's the important part?
Well, even though you're keeping the temperature under control, you still have the mechanical effort, the shear effort between the gears and the fluid being squished between those two.
Right.
Sorry. So the good thing about these ester formulations is that you don't rely in polymers to keep that excellent viscosity to maintain those components spread out. You don't need any viscosity index improvers to give you this right thickness that will keep your engine components or transmission components in this case alive for longer.
Okay.
That is very important, and you get it from these esters. And you might wonder, well, in layman's terms, what is that, Nico? Well, it's important because you are always going to have a 75W140 regardless of the operating conditions.
Okay.
You are not relying on a component that might fail under shear and left you stranded with a 75W90 or even lesser if it gets sheared down.
So it's more stable.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And it sounds like all esters are not created equal.
No.
Seeing the word ester on the bottle doesn't really mean anything. It has to be the right esters.
Yes, exactly. And
Now we
you
know.
even have other components coming into play to help those esters last longer inside the engine or inside the transmission. So the idea is keeping this efficiency throughout the race, not going out on first, second, third lap with a level of performance that all of a sudden shifts because your components got degraded.
Okay. Makes sense. Perfect for a car like this that goes out for session after session.
Exactly. And that's the reason why Nismo Competition Oil Differential 75W140 is the only differential oil that you can put inside a GTR. You can check on the user's manual, it's the only thing that Nismo recommends.
Right. Okay. You mentioned GTR. You've seen the brakes on this thing. We have Nissan and GTR OEM calipers and rotors. They're big, they're beautiful, and they work really well. So for our application, what do you recommend?
Well, absolutely RBF 660. Well, you folks probably know already, RBF stands for racing brake fluid.
Easy enough.
Yeah, and racing brake fluid, it's because of what? Higher temperatures.
Right.
You know, big heat concentration in relatively small calipers. Because even though they're big, how much fluid do you put inside?
Right, it's not a whole lot.
Exactly. You would go for tops, what, a quart?
About there, yeah.
And they get tremendously heat up because you're using maybe ceramic discs or very hard discs, very hard brake pads, and that heat needs to be dissipated somehow. And the calipers are going to soak up a lot of that heat, and you don't want your brakes boiling. Once your brakes start to boil or your brake fluid starts to boil, you have a spongy pedal and all of a sudden a big scare.
Is there anything as far as driving on the street? Do we have any, if we have to drive this to the track, which obviously we can't, it's not road legal, doesn't have any, no windows, no nothing. If I want to put this in my car, which is a street legal car that only gets driven on the track, but sometimes I drive it to the track, can I run 660?
Absolutely. The good thing about our brake fluid lines is that they are all DOT approved.
Okay.
And that means even though in cold weather, you're still going to have very good flow properties so that your ASR, your ESP systems work accordingly, you know, which is not the case with some of the other racing brake fluids.
Right.
The thing about this is that you can track it, it's been track proven, but you can also use it on your daily driver, on your daily driver without any concerns about the fluid maybe not performing if it gets cold, or your fluid getting degraded sooner than expected.
Right, and that's great for people like myself who I have a second set of pads that I use for the street, because pads are very easy to swap, but fluid's not. Mm-hmm. So I can leave the same fluid in, swap pads, and keep going.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
Best relationship between daily driver, track toy, and strictly racing.
Right, great. Okay guys, just to recap, for your time attack car, your race car, when you're looking for the utmost performance, you've got Nismo Competition 5W40, Nismo Competition gear oil 75W140, and RBF 660 brake fluid, and for your clutch as well. Nico, thank you so much for explaining this all to me. I've learned a lot. I'm sure the viewers have as well. We appreciate coming in.
Well, thanks Kyle for having me in. Thanks C1, and I hope you guys like it. Send over your questions.
I'll do that. See you next time.